Hello, welcome to another video from the conscientious biologist, Ben Gallagher. This is the fourth one in the evolution series, and it's probably the most important one. This is the one that looks at natural selection as the main theory for evolution. So if there were any of the evolution ones that you were really going to focus your attention on, this one would be it. It's from the GCSE syllabus, and as always, I'll ask that you please do subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you. So to understand evolution, you really first need to make sure you fully understand what DNA is and how DNA is involved in protein synthesis. Because you'll remember from the phase 1 videos, proteins do everything. Everything about an organism or a cell on its own is controlled by the proteins that it can produce. So let's just quickly review how that happens. So you should remember from my previous videos that DNA is a code for a sequence of amino acids. A ribosome within a cell can read the genetic information held by the DNA code, and it can use that to arrange amino acids, which I'm using emojis here to symbolize. It puts them in the specific sequence as dictated by the code in the DNA. So DNA is literally a list, and the ribosome goes, okay, I want that one first, then that one, then that one, and it makes this chain of amino acids. That chain is called a polypeptide. Now, to continue the process, if I just shrink that down, and you need to remember that a polypeptide would be way more than just these 15 amino acids. There'd be hundreds of them. So it'd be loads and loads and loads. And to make this simple, I'm going to replace those emojis with just the long straight blue line. That long blue line is representing the polypeptide, the long chain of amino acids. Now, what needs to happen to that is it needs to fold up, but it folds in a very specific way, and that's due to the sequence of amino acids that it contains. And remember, that sequence was dictated by the DNA. So if the amino acids were in a different order, they'd fold into a different way. If one of them changed and switched out, it could affect how it folds up. And the folding is vitally important, because if we just draw around the outside of that folded shape, which is how we normally represent proteins, we don't draw the whole wiggly line, we just draw the external structure like that. But that creates its shape, and shape determines function. That's true of everything. Your hands function as hands because of their shape. A cup that you have drink in, a pen, everything does its job because of its shape. And the shape that proteins form is dependent on how they fold, and how they fold is dependent on the sequence of amino acids, and that sequence was set out in the DNA. This is essential. If any of this is unfamiliar or confusing, or you've just stumbled across this evolution video, please go back and find my 3 videos on proteins. There's a playlist that includes them. That's the most important thing to understand in all of biology. Shape determines function. So when we're talking about evolution, we're thinking about proteins, because an organism's proteins determines their characteristics and adaptations. In other words, how the proteins change shows how evolution moves on through time. So having refreshed yourself on how proteins form, we need to look at this. This is the driving force behind evolution. It's mutation. So let's talk about what mutation is for a minute. So mutations are when there is a small change, and I'm talking one nucleotide. If you don't know what a nucleotide is, go back to the DNA lesson. But if you change one nucleotide in the DNA code, now there are thousands and thousands, millions of nucleotides in your genetic code. Changing just one of them counts as a mutation. So mutation is not like when you see in films that a mutant, oh, it's someone with 4 arms or 2 heads or whatever. They're a mutant, but they're the result of a mutation. The mutation is the change in the DNA code. Now, if you change the code, that might mean that a different amino acid is put in the sequence. So for example, going by the last slide where we looked at protein synthesis again, and I used emojis like this one to represent the amino acids. Just look at this one above my head, and I want you to focus on 3 things about it. It's 2 eyes and its mouth. It's basically a circle with those 3 features in there. On this one above my head, it's got 1 open eye, 1 winking eye, and a smiling mouth. Okay, 3 characteristics. Now, when we're talking about a mutation, we're just talking about a change of another way. So if we just mutated the winking eye to an open eye, we've now totally changed this emoji. We changed it from the winking emoji to the normal smiling emoji. that's a totally different meaning to that emoji just by changing one tiny thing. If we change something else, just the mouth, we turn it into the unhappy emoji. If we add a tear to it, we change it into the next one. We've gone through a sequence there of 4 totally different meanings, 4 totally different emotions that can be conveyed by something by changing a tiny thing. And this is really what we're talking about with mutations. But instead of changing eyes or a mouth on an emoji, you're changing one of the nucleotides. There's only 3 nucleotides that code for each amino acid. But you change any one of those 3 and it could result in having a new amino acid in the sequence. And of course that would lead to the polypeptide folding into a different shape because one of its amino acids is now different. The sequence is different. If the sequence is different, it could fold into a different shape, so it will have a different function. This is how evolution can throw up a new characteristic totally out of nowhere, a totally new thing that hasn't existed before can suddenly arise because there's suddenly a new protein that didn't exist before, and that protein's doing something new. So you really need to think about it as like a tiny spelling mistake in a sentence, but one which changes the whole meaning of the sentence. This is a bit trickier to get your head around because it's not as simple as these emojis, because a protein is like a very long sentence worth of amino acids. And if we're only changing one, how can that change the entire protein? But it can, if you think of it as a sentence. If I put on here, I got hit when I went out for a walk earlier. Well, that's unfortunate. Who hit you? What did you get hit by? Hit by a car? That's suddenly quite a scary sentence. I got hit when I went out for a walk earlier. If we mutate just one letter in there, if I change the I of hit to an O, it's I got hot when I went out for a walk earlier. And now you've got a totally different meaning to that sentence, a different mental image in your face. Instead of worrying about me stepping out the front door and someone hitting me, I just step out and it's a sunny day. Totally different meaning, only one letter difference. If I mutate it again and I add a nucleotide in, suddenly we're back to something terrifying. I got shot when I went out for a walk earlier. Tiny, tiny changes can make a big impact to the whole sentence. Same with DNA, but the whole sentence is a gene because one gene codes for one polypeptide, which in most cases gives you one protein. Okay, so it's basically a mutation is a spelling mistake in your DNA. Now, mutations happen all the time. Right there, sat now as you're watching this, chances are there will be mutations happening in your body, but most of them don't do anything. Now, they could happen accidentally when cells replicate their DNA and make a mistake. If you think back to the mitosis lesson, which go back and watch it if you haven't done already, you'll know that as a cell grows and goes from that one cell, that one circle, and it grows and doubles in size so that it can divide in 2, during that growth process, it needs to double its quantity of DNA so that each new cell has a full set. Now that's copying out a huge amount of genetic information. If I asked you to copy out an entire massive novel by hand, chances are you'd make the odd mistake. Well, that can happen naturally when your cells are replicating their DNA. So that's probably happening all the time in your body. But generally, if a cell's got a mutation in it, it either won't make any difference because the cell might not use that bit of DNA, or the cell just won't work and that cell will die, which also doesn't matter to you. So most mutations really don't matter. But they can happen as well when the DNA may chemically switch some bases in response to a mutagen. Now, mutagen is something external to the body that can cause a mutation. So some types of chemical, lots of chemicals in cigarette smoke, if you smoke, really bad thing, or radiation, including UV radiation from the sun, which is why the sun can cause skin cancer, because cancers are just when a cell mutates, a bit of its DNA that controls how quickly it divides, mutates, telling it to divide too fast, so it divides and forms a lump, which is a tumour, and that lump can cause problems. So mutagens are very bad because they can cause mutations as well. The point I'm making, though, is that mutation is the driving force behind evolution because it's mutation that can create new proteins, and it's that emergence of a new protein or a new characteristic that is the fundamental concept in evolution. Okay, so this is the really, really important slide, because this is where we look at the theory of evolution as developed by Charles Darwin all that time ago, and it still holds water. It still rings true. All of the new evidence and things that we're finding just add more evidence to support Darwin's original theory of evolution. What I should make clear, though, is this part of evolution theory that we study at GCSE is something called directional selection. It's only one of various mechanisms that contribute towards evolution. The rest you'll learn about at A level, and we're going to touch on one of them slightly in the next slide. But in this one, we're focusing on the main backbone theory of evolution, which is directional selection, as come up with by Charles Darwin. So if we start off with an original species A, it doesn't matter what it is, because this theory applies to all organisms. But if we've got an organism and it's alive, it must be well evolved. It must have excellent adaptations to the selective pressures that it lives under. If it didn't, it would have died out. It would have gone extinct. So we know species A is successful because it exists. Now that means species A is always going to prefer to breed with other members of species A to maintain species A and have little species A babies and keep species A going and going and going. So this is called stabilizing selection. It keeps the species exactly the same over hundreds or thousands of years. However, every now and again you get a mutation in the DNA. And if that mutation is in a sperm cell or an egg cell or a very early embryonic cell, then the mutation is going to be in every single cell that follows and be in every cell of the mutant offspring. Now what that means is that mutant offspring is going to make a new version of a protein in its cells. Now 99.9% of the time that's going to be a disadvantage, because mutation is entirely random. It's a nucleotide somewhere in the DNA that just switches and changes. The chance of that creating a better protein are very, very small, because millions of years of evolution have gone into creating genes for proteins that are really good. If you make a random change to it, it's unlikely to improve it. It's as if you've got a really highly tuned, perfect Formula One car engine and you just randomly smash it somewhere with a hammer. Yes, it might jolt something or jog something or compress something in a way that could be advantageous. But if you smash a highly tuned piece of machinery with a hammer, it's likely to do it some damage. Same with mutations. So it's likely to be a disadvantage. If you've got an organism with a disadvantage, it's likely to die. And if it dies, you're going to lose that new mutant allele, that new mutant bit of DNA. That's what an allele is. It's a version of a gene. That new mutant allele for the new protein that caused a disadvantage anyway. So that's good that it disappears. However, every now and again, that random mutation might create a protein that gives an advantage. And it doesn't matter what that advantage is. It could be that the organism's got tougher scales on its outside, which makes it better defensively against any predators, or so it doesn't get caught on bushes or spikes or anything like that. It could be that the protein is an enzyme that makes it digest food better and get more nutrients from it. It could be a protein that makes its fur a slightly different color to give it a better type of camouflage. It doesn't matter what it is. If that protein, that mutant protein, gives an advantage, then it's a new adaptation, which means that new mutant offspring is going to be a better competitor than all of the rest of species A. Now, if it's a better competitor, ultimately what that means is it's going to breed more and the mutant numbers will increase. Now, why it can breed more is it's going to get bigger, stronger, healthier, fitter, faster. It's going to be able to dominate the others of its species. It's going to be able to win the member of the opposite sex to breed with. It might even just be that because it's healthier and got an advantage, it lives longer, so it's got more years in which it can breed. But by whatever mechanism, that mutant with its advantage is going to end up having more offspring than one of the original ones. So the mutant numbers will increase. Now, with more mutants in the next generation with that advantage, they're all going to breed more than the original one and increase it again. So that increase just keeps going. Every generation you get more and more and more of the offspring of the mutants as they are better able to compete. Now, if that goes on for long enough, then the non-mutants, the original species A, can't compete under the selective pressures, so they're outcompeted. This really important word here. The original ones are outcompeted. Now, you may not know that that's happening if you were just looking at a population, because the mutant protein may be something that you can't even see or notice. But the original ones will just start to die out, and that will continue until you've only got the mutants left. Now, at that stage, if it's only mutants, do you now call them species B? Because they're not the original species A, they're the mutant version. Well, no is the answer. And it comes down to looking at the definition of a species. We're going to break the species definition down into two parts over there. The first part of the species definition is this. By the way, this is only the most widely accepted definition of a species, because there's no single definition of what a species is. It's still massively debated by the scientific community. But generally speaking, we say that organisms belong to one species if they're a group of organisms that show similar morphology. Morphology is kind of how they look. Do they have 4 legs, or do they have arms, or do they have fur? Do they have big canines, or whatever? Morphology is kind of how they look. Physiology, which is how they're put together. So same organs. Do they have a heart with 4 chambers? Do they have a brain? You know, those kind of things. So physiology. Biochemistry, that's their proteins, their DNA, if you compare them on that level. And do they behave in the same way? So they have to have the same morphology, physiology, biochemistry and behavior. And even then, if they've got those 4 things, this is the qualifying statement, they still need to be able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So you need 2 organisms with same morphology, physiology, biochemistry and behavior. And when they breed, they have a little baby that has the same morphology, biochemistry, physiology, behavior as the parents, and that one can also produce more of the same species, so the species can carry on throughout the generations. If 2 organisms can't produce fertile offspring, then it will die out at that generation. So you've got to qualify for those. Now, we know that our mutant version from this diagram can breed with species A and have fertile offspring, because that's how the mutant numbers increased. So species B isn't true to say of this. It's not species B, it's species A, but Mark II. It's a very slightly improved, slightly upgraded version. So at what point can you call it a different species? Well, let's look at that up here. If we started off with species A, and we've just gone through a process to say how it became A, A2, and it can then go on over time to go through A3, A4, A5, and so on, right the way up to A67 or whatever. I've just picked 67 randomly. It might be Mark 273 or whatever, okay? But once you've gone through enough evolutionary changes and improvements, once you've gone through that whole process multiple times, that if you could now compare species B with the original species A it came from, you'd go, well, they no longer have the same morphology, physiology, biochemistry and behavior, and they can't interbreed to produce fertile offspring anymore because they've become so different. Therefore, it's a different species. So this process represents one evolutionary event, but it takes many of these evolutionary events to make massive change enough to create a new species. Take a screenshot of this because this is the most important slide from this video. Now, I want to very quickly go through something called speciation. I said on the last slide that that was directional selection and that that's only one main mechanism. Now, the more intelligent amongst you perhaps might have looked at that last one and gone, well, hang on, if that were the only mechanism of evolution, there would only be one organism on the planet, because the previous one is always outcompeted and dies off, but we've got multiple ones. So let's just very quickly talk about this concept of speciation. Speciation is the word for an increase in number of species. It's why we don't just always outcompete the previous one. Okay, so let's look at a few fundamental points first. These are 3 essential things I want you to keep in your head anytime anything comes up on evolution. Point number 1, mutation is totally random. It's any nucleotide in any gene at any time. 2, there are many ways in which an organism can improve. So just because you get a mutation that gives an advantage, well, you could have had a mutation that gave a totally different advantage. It could be an advantage that makes it a better hunter, or it could be a mutation that makes it better at avoiding predators. Totally different things, still convey an adaptation and an improvement. So there's loads of ways that you can improve. 3, advantages are very specific to each environment. So if you've got a polar bear, it's brilliantly, amazingly well adapted and evolved for living where it lives. You dump it in the rainforest and it would die very quickly. Its amazing adaptations for its environment are useless when you put it in a different environment. Same for all organisms, okay? And we don't all live in the same place. Hence why evolution is going to happen differently in different areas. Now, just some silly animations to try and help you understand this. If I put a little creature over there, so he's got one eye, he's got his little mouth, he's got short legs, but he's pretty rubbish. But he is alive, he exists, so he must be well enough adapted for where he lives. But let's say he multiplies and he spreads out, and there's exactly him, his species, but they've now spread out to multiple locations. Well, what if that top one in its location undergoes evolutionary events that turns it green? Very simple. Change in a protein that it makes in its skin cells that turn it green. An advantage because maybe that one lives in a jungle where green gives it better camouflage. So it's less likely to get eaten by predators, or it can sneak up on its prey more easily. It's a great adaptation. In a different area, this one might remain exactly the same because where it lives is the same as where the original lived, and its adaptations are all fine, apart from it grows another eye. Something goes wrong in a developmental gene that instead of making one, a different cell somewhere else goes, let's make one as well. And it becomes two-eyed. Now suddenly 2 eyes allows it to judge distance, gauge depth, be able to zoom in on a prey better or find its food better. So this one, 2 eyes. Same as the original one, apart from it's got this second eye. That's a big advantage. Down on the bottom there, this one, maybe this one moved to a habitat where there wasn't much fruit or things like that to eat. There was only other animals to eat, so it had to adapt to get better at hunting and killing. So it evolved big fangs to eat. So now we've got a scarier version of that first one. And maybe let's carry on with that one, because if in its environment everything was having to evolve to get bigger teeth and scarier and fiercer, it needs some kind of defense. So then after a few more evolutionary events, it grew horns, and we've got this terrifying little guy here, okay? But maybe the next one up, because it lived maybe more in, I don't know, bamboo forests or something where it couldn't squeeze through between gaps, it had to get much thinner and a bit taller so it could move more easily through gaps. So we got a thinner, taller version of the original. Maybe this top one here, because it was green, we know it was in jungles, it learned to swing in the trees better, so it evolved to have longer arms to reach between the branches. Or maybe it didn't change at all and it just stayed as it was. And some of them, that last one that just came up, stayed living nearer the ground, and you got a separate species that lived in the trees. So now even in the same area, under the same selective pressures, you can diversify and have more again. But we've gone from one original to now 4 very different looking creatures just because they've changed randomly in their own environments to exploit a different way of living. This is why there are so many different species all over the planet, because they're each suited to their own environment. And this is a little picture from one of Charles Darwin's notebooks where he sketched out almost exactly what I've done here. Look, a little branching, spreading tree of life. And he even wrote above it these words. That's his handwriting, I think, because he wasn't sure. It was his theory based on his observations. I think this is what happens. That's what Darwin thought. Hundreds of years of evidence are proving him correct. So lastly, for the exams, what we're going to do quickly, we're going to build a full detailed explanation to describe evolution, full of key terms. And what I really want you to make sure you do in exams and try and get this set in your head is you must bridge between topics when you answer. Don't just give a tiny little pigeonholed answer on evolution. Think, can you bridge in some cell biology? Can you bridge into this, like form a little bridge to your biochemistry? Can you link it into adaptations? Can you bring in competition? Can you bring in ecology to make a more comprehensive answer? So let's do that quickly. I don't want to spend long on this. So I'm going to write it out. All the keywords that could be worth a mark I've put in blue. So describing evolution, a random mutation will change a nucleotide in the DNA, which could lead to a ribosome using a different amino acid in the polypeptide during protein synthesis. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 keywords in one sentence. And that links in your biochemistry and your cell biology. We've bridged to those to give us some really good foundations. This different sequence of amino acids will fold into a protein with a new shape, so we'll have a different or altered function. That's another 5 key terms in one more sentence, and it pulls in our protein synthesis theory to really show the examiner what we know. Now we bring in more of the evolution theory, the directional selection, that if that new function gives the organism an advantage under the selective pressures, we call it an adaptation. The new mutant organism will be better at competing, so will be stronger or live longer, and so breed more, which increases the mutant population. The original non-mutants are outcompeted, so die out over time, leaving only the mutants as an evolved version of the previous organism. That is a brilliant description of evolution, absolutely jam-packed with key terms, bridged from various areas of the course. That's what you need to get good at doing. Last couple of points though, these don't include key terms, so I put them separately, but they're very important. This kind of links up the speciation bit we did. That when many of these evolutions have occurred, the result can be classed as a new species, and that mutation is random, so different areas with different selective pressures will see differently adapted creatures evolve over time to survive in different ways. This slide here is a great description for evolution. Take a screenshot of it, and this is the kind of quality of answer you need to be aiming to give in your exams. So hopefully that's all made sense. Evolution, it's not that tricky really. It's just that directional selection. It does branch out to some more complex bits as you get onto A level, but it's just an accumulation of tiny little improvements happening over millions and millions of years. Head on to the next presentation now, which is Evolution 5, the evidence for evolution. This is really looking at all the evidence we've got, or some of the evidence that we've got that backs up Darwin's theory that's been discovered over years and realised that show that evolution really does look to be the driving force behind the complexity of life on this planet. Please do subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. Like this video if you find it useful, and head over to my Facebook page as well for some interesting infographics and different parts of biology to back up your course. Thank you.